Okay, so let me introduce Jean. Jean Lewanda is a speaker and co-author of the memoir, Witness to History. The subject of the memoir is Paul Hoffman, Jean's father. Paul Hoffman survived the Holocaust by escaping to Shanghai and grew to manhood there during a period of World War, invasion, revolution, and communist takeover. It's a thrilling story, and Paul Hoffman was truly a witness to history. Jean, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helene, and thank you for inviting me today to share my dad's memoir with you. This was a book he originally intended only for family. He had written it after he retired in 1986, and he wrote his final entry in November of 1998 when he was 78 years old. He lived another 11 years. He passed away in 2010, and I had known about it. I had read portions of it. Part of it was hard for me to read, and then I was encouraged to publish this story by people who wanted to continue to get the story of the Holocaust and different Holocaust experiences out to others. So on that note, I'd like to begin by introducing you to my family. And this is my dad and my mom. This was probably in 2008. So a couple of years before his passing. My brother, myself, my brother's wife, Jane, my husband, Doug, and these are their grandchildren, my brother's daughters, my son, my daughter, my son's wife, Erica, who is the reason I live in this area now. We are New Yorkers who moved from Connecticut. We raised our children in Connecticut. But the story goes back to the Habsburg Hungarian Empire. A good portion of my family came from the Czech Republic and are descended from rabbis, going back to the Rabbi Judah Loew. I'm the 17th generation removed from the Rabbi Judah Loew, the chief rabbi of Prague. That also family did come from Germany, from we believe the Frankfurt area. Well, these are my father's parents, Oscar Hoffman and Lily Hoffman. My grandfather served proudly on the Romanian front in the Carpathian Mountains during World War I. He brought his young bride to the front with him. He was serving in a hospital on the front. And here are some pictures of them during World War I. It wasn't all danger. They were fairly distant from the fighting. You can see my grandmother here dressed up in a uniform. There's another picture of her smoking a cigar. So there was some fun and games there too. Well, the war ended in 1917, as you know, and my grandmother came back to Vienna pregnant. My father's sister was born in 1918 and my father in 1920. As I said, we're descended from many, many generations of rabbis. My great-grandparents were religious. This is the Hoffman family synagogue, and this is a painting given to my great-grandfather Solomon Hoffman on the occasion of his 80th birthday of the synagogue, where he was a director. This is the front page from 1797, I believe, of the family Haggadah on the Singer family, my grandmother's. There were many small prayer houses in Vienna, and great-grandfather Singer would go to a prayer house that was within walking distance of their home. This is the apartment building where they lived. My father lived the first 18 years of his life. My grandfather finished medical school in Vienna in 1911. Freud was teaching in there at the time. The great anatomist Handler was teaching there at the time. My grandfather was a dermatologist. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. They family residence and the medical office shared the same space. Directly after the war, they were confined to a very small area. Before the Depression, they started expanding. They broke into another apartment. My father's bedroom was always part of the waiting room. And there was a separate waiting room for women. And one of the reasons for that was dermatology also treated venereal disease. And so you had a separate waiting room for women visiting the doctor. There's my grandfather's microscope, which has somehow made it from Vienna to Shanghai, to Boston, to Princeton, New Jersey. It's in my son's house to Connecticut. Between that, I had it in my home and still in the family today. Life in Vienna between the First and Second World Wars was pretty normal. Went to school, winters in the snow, as you can see, a lot of Austrian medals, the snow events and the Olympics, summers in the mountains in Hungary. And there was anti-Semitism, but it was not affecting their daily lives. There was a quota to get into the university. My grandfather obviously met that quota, and sometimes there was beating of Jews in the streets, just arbitrary. It just happened. But they were able to have what we would consider quite a normal day-to-day existence, education, events, such as theater, opera. They participated in everything. My father was bar mitzvahed in the youth service at the Stadttempel in the center of Vienna. He was only at the youth service. He said in Aliyah, they went home for lunch because my grandparents were not observant. They did not attend synagogue regularly. They did not keep kosher. And this is the Stadttempel as it looks today. And you'll see that, it's down a street in central Vienna. In 1798, Franz Joseph II said no houses of worship other than Roman Catholic houses of worship were to be in center city. The actual sanctuary is behind these doors down the hallway. It was the only synagogue that survived the war due to this fact that it was built into this block of buildings where people lived and businesses occurred. This is my dad at 14, shortly after his bar mitzvah. On March 12, 1938, the annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss, happened. And it was the occasion of my grandfather's 50th birthday. There were plans to celebrate his birthday. Within hours, everything changed. Absolutely everything changed. Persona non grata. Somehow people knew you were Jewish, called you names, spat at you. My grandfather's prescription pad that says only allowed to treat Jews. School was closed for a week so that they could reassign all the non-Jewish children to other schools. The humiliation in the streets. The Nazis had painted lots of slogans on the streets. So when you see these pictures of people washing the streets, this was to wash the slogans off. And this was also a means of humiliation and intimidation. Jewish businesses were taken over, damaged. My father was able to finish high school, which was very important. So this was his half-year report card from his junior year, showing that, and I show this because he almost failed out in his junior year. When I present to children, I show that, here's the grades. It was good. satisfactory, good, very good, and nicht satisfactory, not good. And but he managed to study over the summer, pass his exams, and did not fail out. My dad at 18, his sister at 20. So now became evident that everyone had to leave. Where were you going to go? Embassies did not welcome Jews. A little known fact, I think, is that one of the reasons immigration into the United States was so difficult was that something called the Justin Reed Act, which 1924 legislation that said immigration was limited to 2% of the existing population of the United States based on the 1890 census. Well, who was in the United States in 1890? Mostly Anglo-Saxons and German descendants of the Hessians who had supported the revolution. So when people were applying, quotas were not allowing in people from countries all around the world. There was a very strict quota. So it came to the attention of people in Vienna that Shanghai was an open port. And I show this picture here. This ring, this signet ring, is 1 ounce of gold. What you needed to get out of Vienna was a passport. Jews were issued passports where, as soon as they left, they became stateless. A ticket to go somewhere. 1 ounce of gold and the equivalent of $10 in Deutschmarks. So this is my father's signet ring, which he never had to sell. My son has this now. You can see the pH, his 1 ounce of gold. This is Dr. Ho Feng Shan. He was the diplomat in Vienna at the time of the war. Now, you did not need a visa to enter Shanghai. But again, the Nazis were asking for documentation. Dr. Ho had been in Vienna for a couple of years, had befriended many Jews. He was issued orders not to issue any documents to Jews by the Consul General in Berlin, and he defied this order. Now, my father was among the very first to leave. He left in October 30th, 1938, from the train station in Vienna took a train to Trieste, Italy. His sister left the very next day. England had issued visas to people who were willing to work as housemaids and nannies. And she got one of these documents. And so within 2 days, my grandparents said goodbye to both their children. And I'm sure we can all imagine how gut-wrenching that must have been. But as we got into the 1939, early 1940s, Dr. Ho was responsible for literally thousands, I don't know an exact number, of people who were holding documentation that helped people leave. He did not share his story. His daughter was a journalist, and he told her on his deathbed. He was recalled to China because he had disobeyed and he was punished. His career did not go very well, and he ended up in San Francisco at the end of his life. So I show the picture of Kristallnacht, the destruction, because my father was on a boat for 1 month going toward Shanghai, going to India, Singapore, and he did not know where his parents were in Kristallnacht. And they did not know that they could send a telegram directly to the boat. So he had to wait several days until the boat landed in Singapore, where he found out that his parents were safe due to a couple of righteous Gentiles. The concierge, they called it, basically the superintendent of the building. The woman told the troopers when they came to the door, "You've been here already. You know how thorough your people are. There are no more Jews." While my grandmother was upstairs. My grandfather had left to visit a patient. He took a taxi. The taxi driver saw the blockades in the street and basically drove around until he felt it was safe to bring him home. So they survived Kristallnacht. And you can see the continued destruction, which then brings us to Shanghai. Now, in Shanghai, there was a community of Baghdadi Jews, Jews who had come to China during the Opium Wars. They had been thrown out of Iraq and they had gone to India. The Sassoons and the Kaduris, maybe some of you have read the book that's been popular over the last couple of years, The Last Kings of Shanghai. They became incredibly wealthy, partly due to the opium trade. But they owned real estate, they built synagogues, they built schools, they owned the utilities, and they were prepared to receive the refugees. The course of from 1938 till the beginning, real breakout of war, they arranged for the placement of approximately 20,000 Jews from Central Europe, from Germany, from Austria, from Poland. An entire yeshiva came, and they sent buses and wagons down to the port. Shanghai is inland, actually. It is 30 miles down what was known as the Huangpu or Huangpao River. My Chinese is not very good. And Shanghai was a bustling city. The British had come, and the Bund, which is the picture that many people see of Shanghai today, of these huge buildings, intermingled with these beautiful architecturally Art Deco buildings, was where the people arrived. As I said, the buses and vehicles were sent to pick them up, brought them to a reception center on what was called Museum Road at the time, gave them somewhere to sleep overnight, and instructions to come back the following morning to get further instructions. This is the Ohel Rachel Synagogue, which still stands today in Shanghai. This picture was taken in 2019. The Chabad use it a couple of hours. They're allowed to use it on the Jewish holidays. This was built by one of the Sassoons in memory of his wife. Right across the driveway is the Shanghai Jewish School building, which has now been repurposed as, I think, another kind of school. And when I was visiting Shanghai in 2019, there is a museum, which I'll talk more about, which was the synagogue where my parents married. I found this picture, and this is my mother's brother in the Shanghai Jewish School in 1943. My mother was a Russian Jew who was born in the north of China, in the city of Harbin. Harbin is now a city of 11 million people. Prior to the building of the Chinese Eastern Railway, Harbin was a fishing village. And actually, Harbin got the status of the Paris of the East before Shanghai due to the railroad and its proximity to Europe. Fashion came through there. And there still is European style buildings, there are restaurants. The food is much more Russian and European in that area of China still today. People vacation there to experience that. And it is a very, very wealthy in natural resource area of the country, which was one of the reasons the Japanese took over and then were eventually came into Shanghai in 1937. So when these refugees arrived, they saw a lot of bombed out houses because they were sent to live in the Hangqiu section. Now, Hangqiu, this photograph was taken by my uncle in 1939, the street corner in Hangqiu. It is made up of lanes. It was the poorest section of town. It was basically the low rent district. So it was what was available, and refugees were given housing there. My uncle, who came from Berlin in 1939, he spent his entire war years there. He married my father's sister in 1942. I have many pictures of what Shanghai looked like at that time because he earned his living as a photographer. When the Japanese took over control, as there were more and more refugees, controls got tighter, they insisted that everyone have identity cards. And these identity cards required pictures. And he had come with a 35mm camera, and he found a friend who had an enlarger, and he put up a sign that said, taking identity card pictures. And the authorities said, oh, you can't put up your flyers, it's private property. And the next day, the Jewish paper and the English language paper said, refugee, reprimanded by authorities for putting up flyers. And as he said, that was the best advertising he could have had, because then everyone knew about him and he started taking everyone's photo. As the ghetto grew and people developed, really, again, they strived for a normal life. Restaurants, schools, entertainment. He's continued to make money taking family photographs and restaurant photographs. And he would go outside the ghetto as well to Chinese restaurants and Russian restaurants. And so we have many, many photographs of what life was like in Shanghai. He was 18 when he arrived, and he spent his first night in Hangqiu, and then he said, I'm never going to go back there if I can help it. He was asked to share a room with a married couple. There was a pot there, and I neglected to tell you about, this is what Hangqiu looks like today. This is 2019. And the lane's still this narrow, people hanging out their laundry. The difference may be air conditioning, still no indoor plumbing for most of these homes. This man is emptying the honeypot, as they called it. During the war years, there was a poor Chinese person who came with a honey cart, they called it, and you brought your waste down and dumped it in the cart. Now there's a building here where you can come and dump your waste every morning. Most of the houses do have a hookup for a sink in this front foyer here. So that comes just shortly before the holidays. And as I said, he spends his first night in the ghetto, and then he finds some distant relatives who help him tremendously. He sleeps a couple of nights on a mattress on their floor, and then finds an apartment on the corner of the French concession with two other refugees, two other young men. Now, the international settlement was part of the settlement after the Opium War. There was a French concession. There was the international part of it was the British and Americans decided to work together. The thing about living in Shanghai and why it was so popular for people to come there, even in the 20s and 30s, is that you could live there, do business there, speak your own language. Actually, English became the lingua franca of the settlement. And you were under the laws of your nationality. There was something called the municipal court, and there were representatives of every nationality. And so if you did something, you were not subject to Chinese law, which could be very harsh. Dad's English became very good very quickly, and he was selling advertising for XMHA, a English language radio station that was very pro-Chinese, very anti-Japanese. And he hired him, and for a while he was selling advertising until he found out that he could make more money tutoring and teaching. So he went on to work for the American school based on the recommendations of his tutoring. And here you can see he earned enough money to hire a private rickshaw driver. And in his first days in Shanghai, he said he refused to use the rickshaw. To see a human pull another human being was unacceptable, but people realized very quickly that the rickshaw drivers did not fare any better if you did not use them. They needed your fare, and you were charged more because you were a foreigner. And he hired a private rickshaw driver that he shared with this woman who had come over on the boat with him. And he knew that the rickshaw driver took him to school or wherever he needed to go, took Mrs. Ellig to wherever she needed to go, and then got other fares. And he said we were guaranteed a rickshaw at the right time that was clean, and the rickshaw driver had the opportunity to still make additional money by hiring private fares. This photograph is one of the restaurants, one of the areas within the Hangzhou ghetto, which in 1943, the Japanese decided to get strict. My dad was able to keep himself and his family out of the ghetto until 1943. But that's ended in when the Japanese decided, under pressure from the Germans. The Germans were counseling the Japanese that they had to do something about the Jews. But the Japanese were very cautious because the Japanese had had some positive experiences with Jewish people back in the Sino-Russo War. Jacob Schiff, the banker, was so upset about the pogroms in Russia that he lent money to the Japanese, because figuring this was one way to pay back the Russians for the horrible results of the pogroms. So they had that in the back of their minds. They also thought that Jews had a lot of power in America. And if they, didn't want to totally alienate themselves from people who they could eventually think they may have to rely on. So when everyone did have to move into the ghetto in 43, my father had successfully brought his sister from England in the beginning of 1940. Actually, the war broke, it was end of 39. He said it's safer to be in Shanghai, and he sent her money to get a ticket. She boarded a French boat the day the war broke out. For 1 month, he did not know where she was. The French refused to communicate. So on the day the boat was scheduled to arrive in Shanghai, he went down to the pier, and there she was. He found out that all the Jews had been told they had to go into the hold of the boat, and they were being threatened with being left in French Indonesia. She stepped off the boat and said, "I'm hungry." And she came to live with my dad. A couple of months later, they found out that their parents had received deportation orders to Poland, which, as we know, would have been being transported to the death camps. So by that time, as I said, the Japanese had tightened regulations, and my father went to the head of the Jewish hospital and said, I need the promise that you will employ my father to get a document to allow my parents to come. And the doctor said, I don't have any jobs. So many professionals had come, they had more than enough doctors. And he said, I promise I will not call this chit in, just give me the paperwork. And he got one of the very first documents. And so he had that in hand, but then the Nazis said they needed payment of a ticket in US dollars. Well, you weren't allowed to have US dollars in Vienna at the time, but my grandfather's youngest brother had left at the very beginning of the war with his family for Boston. He also was already a practicing dermatologist, and he had met the daughter of Morgenthau in the previous summer, and she had, connections and got Uncle Richard and his family a visa into the United States, and he was very instrumental in getting my grandparents. So by early 1940, the family had been reunited, as well as one of my grandmother's sisters and her husband in Shanghai. So life went on again. What do you do when your family's together? And so this is the faculty of the American school. Well, once Pearl Harbor happened, the Americans had to leave or risk either being jailed or interned. It was just as we had an internment camp for the Japanese were interning Americans. The head of the school, Frank Cheney, was in internment camp. My father was able to continue his effort. It was called the American Private School. He gathered students in their homes, several at a time. He worked with their parents and continued the school until 1945, when the internment camp was shut down with when the war was over, and Unc Cheney, as they called him, was released, and the teachers started coming back, because the Americans who had done well between earlier on, before the war, came back to China. If you're living in China was a good place to be if you were being paid in American dollars and you were conducting business. Big companies like Coca-Cola, Exxon, they were all operating, General Electric, they were all operating in Shanghai. So there was opportunity. Well, while he was tutoring and living in the ghetto, Dad decided he needed to continue his education. And this is the graduating class of 1946 of Aurora University, now known as Fudong University. This is the building, and still exists today, still a prominent university. So at the same time the class was graduating at the American school in 1946, Dad was graduating from the university. And the university was taught by French Jesuits and was mostly for Chinese students. Many of the courses taught in Chinese, but also courses taught in French. Dad thought he wanted to be an actuary. They had a course in finance mathematics, so he thought this was the way to go. The gentleman standing back here is, at that time, was known as Joseph Tukashinsky, later on as Joseph Tekoa, became the ambassador to the United Nations for Israel. And they graduated neck and neck in the graduating class of 1946. So the American teachers were coming back. One of the teachers at the school was a woman named Trey Copps. And she said, Paul, you've got your law degree now. My husband is the second partner in a law firm, a prominent American law firm on the Bund, almost on the Bund there, Ullman, Copps and Lee. Judge Ullman, he was called judge because he had sat on the municipal court. He was not officially a judge, but that was a nickname that stayed with him for life. He had come to China in the diplomatic corps as a student interpreter in 1916. He was a farm boy from West Virginia, a hard drinking, cigar smoking, horseback riding polo player. And he ran this law firm. And so my father went for an interview with Mr. Copps, Paul Copps, and he spent his last $20 on a suit. And by the time he got home, there was a phone call that he should report on Monday for work. And he was what was known as a factotum. He was a do everything kind of guy. And he really learned how to practice the law by fire. So here it is 1946, and I'm going to go back there just to stay with the law firm for a little bit. Life was good. He was earning American dollars. He bought a car. He got his parents a better apartment. My aunt and uncle left for the United States in 1947 on a transport, on a military transport. They celebrated Passover on this US military transport into San Francisco. I have the Haggadah that they used. Was a military issued Haggadah, and it's inscribed, we celebrated Passover on this ship. My father figured he was hoping that things would settle down and the Chinese would be willing to really continue their moving forward with the economy. And there was a very colonialized society. There were social clubs, there were parties, there was the racetrack. Well, in 1949, September, he meets this attractive young Russian woman, and they decide to get married. By 1949, the communists had marched in May of 1949. So now we're a few months under communist control, and things are not as good as they obviously were even days before. So they marry in January in my father's law office because my mother is stateless. She has no passport other than a Russian passport that her father had gotten for her when she was 16. And this was a one-way ticket to the Soviet Union. This was not truly a passport. He marries her in January so that he can put her on his reinstated Austrian passport. And they were married in the Ohel Moshe Synagogue. This is what the Ohel Moshe Synagogue looks today. It has been renovated. It was a warehouse for a while. It was used for different things. This is a beautiful statue out in the front courtyard of the synagogue. Oops, let's go back. And now it is getting more and more dangerous for Americans to be there. The Korean War is starting, and my father's boss says to him, will you stay behind and settle the business? Close our law offices and shut down the offices of some of our clients, one of which was US Lines, which turned into a major problem because the United States Treasury froze funds. And they were, every Friday, they were locking my father into the office and saying, where's our money? And he would say, I don't have it yet. And he had a system with my mother that she would call him at certain times. And, one day she hears the phone slam down. She hears it slam down again. She comes with the police to get him out of the office. And so this went on for 2.5 years. being observed. There was a Chinese observer who watched every move that he made. Finally, the money did come through. Finally, they received their visas. And by this time, my mother was 7 months pregnant. They left on a train to Canton. The train ride took 60 hours. They were locked into their car in the train. So when they got to Canton, they had to go on a bus to a hotel, report to the police the next morning. And then from Canton, they traveled to Hong Kong. And once they were in Hong Kong, they were finally safe. The rest of the story, which I see we're running out of time, we're approaching the 45-minute mark, was my brother was born in Vienna in May of 1952. They traveled, once they were in Hong Kong, they were on a boat again for a month, retracing my dad's steps. I have some lovely pictures of my mother in Venice. My father wanted to make sure she saw Venice because he loved Venice when he saw it 13 years earlier. And they arrived in Marseille. They took a train to Italy to find out the status of their papers. By then, they had made the decision they had to go to Vienna. One of my father's cousins, who was a doctor, was there. My brother was born. They left Vienna when my brother was 3 months old because they were told that their paperwork was ready. The visa section was in Genoa, and they lived in Nervi then for 9 months because when they found out that my mother was Russian, there was a whole nother level of inquiry because her father's name was Avram Frolov, and there was a communist leader, and now it was the McCarthy era. And he was a labor leader in San Francisco, and they had to double check to make sure that, and my grandfather had died in Israel. My mother's parents had immigrated to Israel. So this is the first picture taken of the entire family by my uncle, the photographer. He was not in the picture here, but my father's sister. My cousin was born in Shanghai in 1945 in the Jewish hospital, fortunately did not suffer any of the illnesses and that people were subject to. I failed to mention that the ghetto, the sanitation was awful. Bed bugs, not only lack of plumbing, malaria, dysentery, it's common, everyone had it. So this was the first, my grandparents, my brother now 11 months old. I arrived a year later, April 1953. So, and I believe this is Lake Wallenpaupack. I think this is the Poconos. Oh, these are my parents. So my dad became a lawyer for General Electric. Some of his clients were the same clients that he serviced while he was in China. He sent work to the law firm was Ullman, Cops and Lee. He was sending work to Lee and Lee that was established in Taiwan. This silk here, this is a Buddhist goddess, still hangs in my house today. It made the trip all the way. It was a wedding present. Some other beautiful things that the people say, how did this stuff survive? Well, because one of those clients was United States Line, my father made a deal that their stuff be packed up more than a year before they left and was shipped to the United States and was sitting in a warehouse. So a good number of pieces of furniture and artwork are still with us, dishes, silver, because of this bit of luck. And he would have told you he was very lucky. He escaped. He never pretended that he was a survivor. He wanted people to know that he was one of the few who avoided some of the horrors of the war. For the most part, most of our family did. My grandfather's oldest brother had multiple sclerosis and was wheelchair bound. He and his family did not survive. My grandmother's oldest sister their son was sent to the United States due to a relative on the other side, and they believed that because their son was in the States that they would receive a visa to the States, but it was too late. They did not make it. So I thank you all for your attention. If you're interested about more about this story, there are so many stories within the story that 45 minutes always feels very rushed to tell about it. I would love to take any questions that anyone has right now. So Helene, if there are any questions.
It looks like Shelley has a question.
Jean, I was happy to see, and was it the same picture that the photograph that appeared on the cover that appeared in the Jewish Exponent just this week? So I was, as soon as I saw it, I thought, having heard your story before, that you must have you must be referenced in there, and you were, and I'm glad that this story has gotten out, because, as you said, it was not at least to me, it was not a well-known story. I think maybe about 15 years ago, I happened to be at a convention in Los Angeles, and the Museum of Tolerance had an exhibit in the basement of the museum about Jews who sought refuge in Shanghai, and it was a total new fact to me.
Was there panels? Was it the traveling exhibit?
I believe so.
Okay, so how this all got started was the exhibit was coming to the Hartford, Connecticut area. And when they found out about my family, they said, wouldn't it be great to have a local connection? And they connected me with the Confucius Institute and the museum in Shanghai, and they came to my house, they took pictures, and there now is a panel of my parents in the traveling exhibit. And then I said, well, I have other family, and my uncle had taken so many pictures, so I got another panel made, and the traveled, this was 2017, it then traveled to Washington, DC. So there's a panel representing my aunt and uncle too in the exhibit that you saw. So that's what got this all started. Well, thank you. Any other?
Hello?
Arthur has a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just had a comment here. I recently read another book, Under the Shadow of the Rising Sun, about the Japan and the Jews during the Holocaust era by Marin Mezzini.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it was very interesting because you were right, they didn't know what to do with the Jews. And they basically left them alone. They thought that the Jews controlled the United States.
Mhm. Well, there's the story of Sukihara and the Jews that was saved by the Japanese, and the yeshiva that came from Poland, I believe, came through Japan. My father references a book by a Kranzler, and he taught at Queens Community College, and this book actually was his PhD. I read it. It was, I think, more than 600 pages, but there were so many references to that after each chapter. And he talks very much about, Jacob Schiff and, the Jewish bankers in America. And yeah, pretty fascinating that. And one of the reasons that China was such a wonderful place, it turned out, for Jews to go, is there was no anti-Semitism. The Chinese did not treat Jews any differently than any other foreigners. there was a sharing of community at different levels. I mean, as I said, one of the three major partners in the law firm, one was Chinese. House servants were very loyal. They worked in the Russian homes and then in other nationalities, the British, the American. They connected at different levels, and there was a respect. And so this really made it a wonderful experience. And over time, the Chinese were very interested in Western music. Many of the buildings that were associated with Jews are now music conservatories. The Shanghai Jewish Club is a music conservatory. Up in Harbin, the school building is now a music conservatory, and they're playing and learning Western music. And the respect of family, of education. My father mentions that you needed a pass to get out of the ghetto. And once the Japanese, forced everyone into ghetto, then they made it, you get passes, you had to sign up every month or two. And he said, I just said I was a student, and that was sufficient to get my pass. I didn't say what else I was doing. I didn't mention I was working, but the fact that I was trying to leave to study. And the head of the ghetto was infamous. His name was Goya. Was this tiny Japanese man who was probably psychotic by the way he behaved. He would jump on the table, he would slap people, and you never knew whether you could get a pass. He, some days he was like, nope, nobody gets one. And he called himself King of the Jews. So it was very bizarre circumstance, but that's the ghetto was also, they took on, like what the Nazis did, when they made Jews be the guards at the entrances. And my father had to do guard duty. And one night he had to stand overnight. And the Chinese were so poor, sometimes they weren't able to bury their dead. And he stood all night by the trash heap with he said a male corpse in the trash heap. Well, anyways, any other questions? I could go on about that for a long time, because all these other things about, there were some of those yeshiva students actually ended up dying for breaking curfew. And again, Dad says, you'd think breaking curfew, one night or 2 nights in jail wouldn't be so bad, but they caught typhus and died. So because of, again, the horrible sanitation.
Jean, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Yeah, first of all, it was a wonderful presentation.
Right, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
So interesting. You mentioned your grandparents. Was that on your mother's side?
Okay, both sets of grandparents were in Shanghai.
Okay.
My mother's family lived in Harbin until 1940. My grandfather came as a runaway. He was 18 years old. He left his family in a shtetl outside of St. Petersburg. He did not want to serve in the military. He told his family nothing. My mother knew nothing about her father's family. I only found out in the last few years that he was the oldest of 8. And they were so scared of what would happen to their family that he never related. All his brothers and sisters became loyal Soviets, fought in the war. My grandmother, my mother's mother, came legally on the Chinese Eastern Railway with her parents and a couple of her sisters. She had older sisters who were already married, who stayed behind in Gomel, which is now part of Belarus. My father's father and mother came to Vienna in 1940 after he was able to get them out and avoid being transported to Poland. And they had to go through relocation camp to come into the States. Again, I mentioned my Uncle Richard, who agreed to help them. He sponsored my aunt and uncle. As I said, they left on a US transport, but my grandparents had to come through relocation camp. They left Shanghai in November, it took them 8 months to come to the United States. They went to Japan, to Hawaii, through the Panama Canal, across the Atlantic, to Italy, they were put in a relocation camp in Bavaria, in southern Germany, called Wildflecken, which was a German military base that the Americans had taken over to shelter refugees.
Amazing story.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Thank you, Jean. That was really interesting. It's an amazing story, as everyone said.
Well, thank you so much, Helene, for inviting me. And I hope one day I'll be able to see your congregation live and in person.
That would be very nice. I put up on the screen for the moment the fact that the paperback and Kindle versions of Jean's book are available on Amazon. And so you can buy it from that, or if you wanted a signed copy, then you could contact Jean directly and she could make that happen for you. And you would do it at jeannie41754@gmail.com. And that's the address there. I'll leave that up for a few moments in case anyone needs to copy that down. I want to thank everybody so much for coming out today. And especially thank you, Jean. It was an excellent presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Okay. Be well.
You too.
Thank you.
41754@gmail.com. Jeannie41754@gmail.com. Jeannie at 41754.